A bubble of molten glass glows with the fierce heat of a dying star, suspended at the end of a hollow iron pipe in the hands of a master craftsman. The orange light illuminates his weathered face as he breathes life into the liquid fire, transforming sand and ash into something approaching magic. This is the moment that has made men wealthy beyond measure, that has inspired deadly jealousy and state-sanctioned murder, and that will remain one of the most closely guarded secrets in all of medieval Europe. Welcome to the glass furnaces of Murano, the island prison where artisans created miracles under threat of death. In November of 1291, every glassmaker in Venice received an order that would change their lives forever. The Great Council of Venice, the ruling body of the most powerful maritime republic in the Mediterranean world, decreed that all furnaces used for glassworking must be moved from the main islands of Venice to the small cluster of islands known as Murano, located less than 2 kilometers north across the lagoon. The official reason given was safety. The glassmaking furnaces, which burned constantly at temperatures hot enough to melt stone into liquid, had caused repeated devastating fires throughout Venice's wooden neighborhoods. The beautiful merchant palaces, the warehouses stuffed with precious silks and spices from the east, the shipyards that built the Republic's unmatched fleet, all of these faced the constant threat of destruction every time a glassmaker stoked his furnace. But there was another reason for this exile, one that the council understood perfectly well, even if they did not write it into their official decree. The glassmakers of Venice possessed secrets worth more than gold. They had learned techniques over centuries from Byzantine craftsmen and traders from Syria and Egypt, combining this knowledge with their own innovations to create glass that no other craftsman in Europe could match. By confining these masters to a single island, Venice could monitor their every movement, control what they produced, and ensure that their precious techniques never escaped to rival cities that would give anything to steal them. The glassmakers gathered their tools, their raw materials, and their families, and made the hour-long journey by boat across the shallow waters of the lagoon to their new home. What they found was not entirely unpleasant. Murano had served as a summer resort for the aristocrats of Venice, dotted with elegant villas surrounded by orchards and gardens. The island air was cleaner than the crowded canals of the main city, the spaces more open, but every man among them understood the unspoken truth of their situation. They had been given privilege and comfort, but they had also been given a cage. The glass workshops that rose from the island of Murano were unlike any other manufacturing facilities in medieval Europe. At the heart of each workshop sat the furnace, a great structure of brick that burned day and night throughout the working season. The fuel that fed these hungry beasts was carefully regulated by law. Only alder and willow wood could be used, and enormous quantities of it were required. The wood had to be thoroughly dried hardwood, kept constantly on hand whenever the furnaces operated. Given that Venice and Murano were small islands surrounded by shallow water with no forests of their own, the logistics of supplying this fuel represented a monumental challenge. Ships laden with timber arrived regularly from the mainland, their precious cargo unloaded at the workshops, where it would be transformed into the fierce heat that made glass-making possible. The master glassmaker began his work long before he ever touched a blowpipe. The creation of fine Venetian glass started with the careful selection and preparation of raw materials, none of which existed anywhere near the islands of the lagoon. The most essential ingredient was silica, the substance that would become the body of the glass itself. Common beach sand could be used for inferior products, but sand carries impurities, particularly iron, that turn glass an ugly green color. The Venetian masters required something purer. By the middle of the 14th century, and likely earlier, they were importing quartz pebbles from the Ticino and Adige rivers in northern Italy. These pebbles, worn smooth by centuries of water flow, contained silica remarkably free of the iron contamination that plagued ordinary sand. But pebbles cannot be melted directly. Before they could enter the furnace, they had to be transformed into fine powder through a process that required both patience and physical strength. The workers would heat the quartz in a small furnace for several days, bringing them to high temperatures before plunging them suddenly into cold water. The thermal shock caused the hard stone to crack and fracture, making it softer and easier to grind. Then began the laborious process of crushing the cracked pebbles into particles fine enough to melt uniformly in the main furnace. This grinding was typically done by hand with heavy stone mortars and pestles, hour after hour, until the quartz became a fine white powder that resembled snow. Silica alone, however, could not be melted with the furnace technology available in the 13th century. The melting point of pure silica exceeds 1500 degrees, far beyond what wood-fired furnaces could reliably achieve. The glassmakers needed a flux, a substance that would lower the melting temperature of the silica and allow it to become workable liquid. The Venetians acquired their flux in the form of plant ash, imported from Syria and Egypt as early as 1285. This material, which they called allume catina, came from coastal plants that absorbed sodium from seawater as they grew. When these plants were burned, the ash they left behind was rich in soda, the chemical compound that would make glassmaking possible. The transformation of raw materials into workable glass occurred in two distinct stages, a process that the Venetian masters had refined over generations. The first stage took place in a specialized furnace called a calcaire, where nearly equal amounts of pulverized silica and plant ash flux were combined and heated while being continuously stirred. This mixture, called frita, was not yet glass. It was a partially reacted compound, a transition state between the raw ingredients and the final product. The continuous stirring prevented the heavier silica from settling to the bottom while ensuring thorough mixing of all components. The frita produced in the calcaire furnace was then transferred to the main melting furnace for the second stage of the process. Here it was combined with selected recycled waste glass known as cullet, broken pieces and scraps from previous work that could be remelted and incorporated into new batches. The addition of cullet served multiple purposes. It helped the batch melt more smoothly, it reduced waste, and it allowed the glassmakers to maintain consistency in their products by including glass of known quality and composition. The molten mixture was heated until it became a glowing liquid, viscous and heavy, radiating heat that could be felt from across the workshop. But the molten glass that emerged from this process was not yet suitable for fine work. Impurities floated to the surface, unreacted salts, tiny bubbles of gas, specks of foreign matter that would ruin the clarity of the finished product. The master glassmaker carefully skimmed the surface of the molten glass, removing these floating impurities in a process that required both patience and skill. Some workshops developed an additional technique for improving clarity. They would cast the molten glass into water, causing it to shatter into small pieces. These pieces were then collected and remelted, and the process might be repeated several times. Each cycle of melting, casting, and remelting helped to drive out trapped gases and unreacted chemicals, resulting in glass of increasingly superior clarity. The composition of the finished glass had to be precisely balanced. Too much flux would make the glass unstable, prone to dissolving when exposed to moisture in the air. Too little would leave it difficult to melt and work. The stabilizing agents that prevented deterioration, lime, magnesia, and alumina, found their way into the glass either as intentional additions or as impurities accompanying the main ingredients. Calcium might arrive on the surface of the quartz pebbles. Magnesia came along with the plant ash. The exact sources and proportions of these stabilizers remained subjects of closely guarded experimentation, passed from master to apprentice within the protected confines of the Murano workshops. When the molten glass was finally ready for working, the master glassmaker reached for his most essential tool, the blowpipe. The Venetians called it the ferro sbuso, or the canna da soffio, a hollow iron tube, roughly 1.5 meters in length, that connected the craftsman's breath to the liquid fire. The technique of glassblowing had spread across Europe during the 9th century, revolutionizing what artisans could create. Before this innovation, glass objects had to be formed by molding, a slow process that limited both the size and complexity of what could be made. The blowpipe changed everything. A skilled worker could now inflate molten glass into any shape his imagination and abilities allowed. The process began with the gather. The glassmaker dipped the end of his heated blowpipe into the crucible of molten glass and rotated it slowly, winding the viscous liquid around the tip like honey around a spoon. The gather had to be precisely sized for the intended object. Too little glass would result in walls too thin to survive handling. Too much would make the piece heavy and difficult to control. The master withdrew his pipe from the furnace with the glowing mass of molten glass attached to its end, already beginning to cool and stiffen in the relatively frigid air of the workshop. What followed was a dance of breath, gravity, and precisely timed movements. The glassmaker lifted the pipe to his lips and blew a steady, controlled breath into the hollow tube. Inside the gather, a bubble formed, pushing outward against the viscous glass. The craftsman rotated the pipe constantly as he worked, using gravity to shape the expanding bubble. If he stopped rotating, the soft glass would sag and deform. If he blew too hard, the walls would thin unevenly. If he blew too gently, the bubble would not expand sufficiently before the glass cooled and stiffened. Every movement, every breath, had to be precisely calibrated based on experience accumulated over years of practice. The tools arranged on the glassmaker's workbench, the scagno, each served a specific purpose in the shaping process. The borselle, a tong-like implement available in various sizes, allowed the craftsman to squeeze, pull, and shape the soft glass while it remained hot enough to deform. A specialized version called the borselle puntata featured textured surfaces that could imprint patterns onto the glass. The taglianti, large scissors with heavy blades, could cut through soft glass cleanly before it hardened. Each tool had been refined over generations, designed by craftsmen who understood exactly what movements the hot glass would allow and what shapes could be coaxed from its yielding surface. For many objects, the work could not be completed while the glass remained on the blowpipe. The pipe was attached to one end of the piece, which meant that end could not be shaped or finished. To work on the rim or opening of a vessel, the glass had to be transferred to another tool, the pontile, which the Venetians called the pontello. This was a solid iron rod rather than a hollow tube. A small amount of molten glass was gathered on its tip and pressed against the base of the partially formed object. Once this attachment cooled and solidified, the glassmaker could crack the piece free from the blowpipe, leaving it held by the pontile. Now the opening could be reheated in the furnace and shaped using the jacks and other tools. The reheating process required constant attention. Glass that has cooled too much becomes rigid and will crack if stressed. Glass that is too hot will lose its shape and collapse. The craftsman repeatedly returned his piece to the opening of the furnace, called the glory hole, rotating it in the radiant heat until it softened just enough to accept the next manipulation. The jacks, a tool resembling large tweezers, allowed him to enlarge openings, thin walls, and create elegant flared rims. The work had to be performed quickly because contact with metal tools cooled the glass rapidly. A complex piece might require dozens of trips to the glory hole, each time softening a different section for a specific manipulation. When the shaping was complete, the finished piece was cracked off the pontile and immediately transferred to an annealing oven. This was a crucial final step that many outside observers did not understand. Glass that cools too quickly develops internal stresses that make it fragile and prone to shattering. The annealing oven maintained a temperature hot enough to prevent rapid cooling, but cool enough that the glass would gradually reach room temperature over many hours. Inside this controlled environment, the molecular structure of the glass relaxed and stabilized. A piece that emerged from proper annealing would be far stronger and more durable than one that had been allowed to cool on its own. The glass produced in the Murano workshops of 1291 served many purposes. Simple vessels for everyday use, drinking cups, bottles, small containers, formed the bulk of production and provided the steady income that kept the workshops operating. But it was the luxury items that established Venice's reputation and commanded premium prices throughout Europe and beyond. Elaborate goblets with intricate stems, decorative bowls painted with enamel and gilded with gold, magnificent chandeliers that transformed candlelight into cascading brilliance. These were the products that drew wealthy customers from every corner of the known world. The coloring of glass represented another domain of closely guarded secrets. The basic Venetian glass had a slight greenish or grayish tint from impurities that the purification process could not entirely remove. But the masters had learned to add specific metallic compounds to create vivid colors that transformed their products into jewels of light. Cobalt oxide, imported at great expense, produced a brilliant blue that rivaled sapphires. Copper and iron could be combined in various proportions to create greens ranging from pale seafoam to deep emerald. The precise recipes for these colors, the exact amounts of each additive, the timing and temperature of their introduction, all of these remained secrets passed down within individual families and workshops. Perhaps no secret was more valuable than the formula for Cristallo, though this particular innovation would not arrive until the mid-15th century, more than 150 years after the move to Murano. The glassmaker, Angelo Barovier, would eventually develop a process for purifying the plant ash flux that resulted in glass of unprecedented clarity, rivaling the transparency of rock crystal itself. But even in 1291, the Venetian masters were producing colorless glass of remarkable quality. The beakers created during this era, examples of which have survived for over 700 years, demonstrate a level of clarity that seriously rivaled what later masters would achieve with Cristallo. The production of this superior colorless glass required manganese dioxide, a compound that the glassmakers called their soap. This material, acquired from the Piemonte region, some 250 miles west of Venice, acted as a decolorizing agent. Iron impurities give glass a greenish tint. Manganese, when added in the correct proportion, counteracted this coloring, neutralizing the green and leaving the glass remarkably clear. The use of manganese as a decolorizer in glassmaking was documented as early as 1290, just 1 year before the decree that moved the industry to Murano. The timing suggests that this innovation may have contributed to the government's decision to consolidate and protect the glassmaking industry. The social position of the Murano glassmakers was unique in medieval Europe. They were simultaneously prisoners and aristocrats, forbidden to leave, but granted privileges that common craftsmen could never dream of attaining. They were allowed to carry swords, a right normally reserved for the nobility. Their daughters could marry noblemen without either party suffering any loss of social standing, and the children of such marriages would be considered nobles, an extraordinary provision announced on December 22, 1376, and likely reflecting practices that had developed earlier. The master glassmakers became wealthy men, their skills so valuable that the state was willing to grant them status approaching that of the ruling class. But this privilege came at a terrible price. The glassmakers were not free men. They could not leave the territory of the Republic without obtaining a permit from the customs authority. Those who dared to depart without permission faced permanent disbarment from the guild, ending forever their ability to practice the only trade they knew. More ominously, those who attempted to share their secrets with foreign powers faced death. The Republic would send assassins to hunt down glassmakers who fled with their knowledge, and executions were carried out at the columns of St. Mark's as a warning to any who might consider betrayal. An ordinance issued in 1292, just 1 year after the move to Murano, explicitly prohibited the processing of glass anywhere other than the designated island, underscoring the strategic importance Venice placed on preserving these trade secrets and maintaining monopoly control over production. This was not merely economic protectionism, it was state security. The glass industry generated enormous revenue for Venice, and the technology that made it possible was considered as vital as military secrets in any other nation. The guild system that governed the glassmakers had been established by the 12th century, creating a formal structure for training, production standards, and the protection of trade secrets. Young boys, typically the sons of established glassmakers, began their training as apprentices around the age of 10 or 12. They started with menial tasks, preparing raw materials, maintaining the furnaces, cleaning the workshops. Over years, they gradually learned the basic techniques of handling hot glass, advancing through stages of skill until they could produce simple items on their own. Only after demonstrating mastery of the fundamental techniques would an apprentice be trusted with the secrets of more advanced work. The hierarchy within a workshop was strictly defined. At the top stood the master glassmaker, who possessed the complete knowledge of all processes and held responsibility for the quality of everything produced. Below him worked journeymen of various skill levels, each specializing in particular aspects of production. Some might excel at the initial gathering and blowing. Others might specialize in the fine manipulation of handles, stems, or decorative elements. The assembly of complex pieces often required the coordinated efforts of several craftsmen working together, each contributing their particular expertise to the final product. The working year was not continuous. The furnaces could not operate during the hottest months of summer, when the already extreme heat of the workshop would become unbearable. During the 1300s, the annual summer vacation lasted 5 months, a remarkable break by medieval standards. This time was used for furnace repair and maintenance, for personal rest, and perhaps for the kind of experimentation and innovation that could not be pursued during the pressure of regular production. The Venetian government later shortened this vacation to 3.5 months, but the glassmakers sometimes complained that even after this reduction, they were not working enough to satisfy their ambitions. The products of Murano traveled throughout the known world on Venice's unmatched commercial fleet. Venetian glass appeared in the courts of kings and the palaces of sultans, in the cathedrals of Christendom and the mosques of the Islamic world. The Republic's dominance of Mediterranean trade meant that Murano glass could reach markets from England to Egypt, from the German principalities to the Ottoman Empire. Wealthy collectors prized Venetian pieces not only for their beauty, but for their technical superiority. No other glassmakers in Europe could match the clarity, the delicacy, or the artistry that the Murano workshops produced. The island itself became a destination for important visitors. Throughout the centuries following the establishment of the glassmaking colony, Murano received queens and dukes, princes and cardinals, ambassadors and military commanders who wished to witness the legendary craftsmanship firsthand. These visitors would be escorted through the workshops, shown demonstrations of the seemingly magical transformation of sand and ash into objects of beauty, and perhaps presented with gifts of extraordinary glass pieces that would become treasures in their own collections. The secret techniques of Murano evolved continuously within their island prison. Later generations would develop filigrana, the art of embedding glass canes in colorless glass to create striped patterns. They would create latimo, an opaque white glass meant to imitate the precious porcelain that arrived from China along the Silk Road. They would perfect millefiori, the thousand flowers technique that arranged tiny colored glass cross-sections into elaborate patterns. They would discover aventurine, the sparkling copper-flecked glass, whose creation was so unpredictable that its name derived from the word for adventure. Each innovation added to the repository of knowledge that made Venice's glassmakers the most sought-after artisans in Europe. The furnaces of Murano burned through the night, their orange glow visible across the dark waters of the lagoon. Inside the workshops, masters and apprentices labored in the fierce heat, their faces reddened by the radiance of molten glass, their hands moving with practiced precision through movements refined over generations. The transformation they achieved seemed almost miraculous. Common materials from riverbeds and coastal plants and distant mountains became objects of transcendent beauty, catching and bending light in ways that seemed to violate the natural order. Rock crystal, the most precious of transparent stones, could be mined only in limited quantities and carved only with enormous difficulty. The glassmakers of Murano could create something that rivaled its clarity and exceeded its versatility, shaping their artificial crystal into any form that imagination could conceive. The decree of 1291 had been intended to protect Venice from fire and protect Venetian secrets from the wider world. It succeeded in both purposes for centuries. The isolation of Murano preserved the knowledge of the glass masters, while the threat of death prevented that knowledge from escaping. But secrets cannot be kept forever. Eventually, in the 16th and 17th centuries, craftsmen would escape despite the risks, carrying their skills to France, to England, to the German states. Foreign powers would learn to make their own fine glass, and Venice's monopoly would gradually erode. Yet even after rivals emerged, even after the Venetian Republic fell to Napoleon and the island workshops declined into mere bead-making, the legend of Murano endured. The techniques that had been developed over centuries could not be entirely lost. In the 19th century, dedicated collectors and craftsmen began the work of revival, studying surviving pieces and ancient records to reconstruct the methods of the old masters. Today, glass workshops still operate on Murano, and artisans still practice techniques that trace their lineage directly back to those medieval pioneers who were first exiled to the island in 1291. The blowpipe that connects a craftsman's breath to molten glass has not fundamentally changed in over 1,000 years. The pontil that transfers the work from one stage to the next, the jacks that shape the opening, the tongs that squeeze and pull the yielding material, these tools would be recognized by any master who worked on Murano in the 13th century. The movements, too, have endured. The constant rotation that prevents sagging, the careful timing of each breath, the precise assessment of temperature by color and viscosity. These skills still require years to master, just as they did 700 years ago. Modern furnaces may burn natural gas instead of alder and willow wood, but the essential relationship between craftsman and material remains unchanged. An old saying from Murano captures the philosophy that guided generations of glass masters. Good tools are nice, but good hands are better. The tools were necessary but never sufficient. What mattered was the knowledge held in the craftsman's mind and the skill developed through endless practice. This knowledge, accumulated over centuries and protected at the cost of human lives, represented the true treasure of Murano. Not the raw materials that could be purchased, not the furnaces that could be rebuilt, but the understanding of how to transform earth and fire and breath into something approaching immortality. The glass objects created in those ancient workshops have outlasted empires. Examples from the 13th century survive today in museums around the world, their surfaces still catching light with the same brilliance they showed when they were first carried, still warm, from the annealing ovens of Murano. They are time capsules of an era when craft secrets were worth killing for, when a glassmaker's knowledge could make him richer than a merchant, but could never make him free. They remind us that some of humanity's greatest achievements have emerged not from liberty, but from confinement, not from sharing, but from jealously guarded secrecy. Knowledge preserved by threats of death and passed down through generations of masters who were simultaneously prisoners and aristocrats, exiles and artists, craftsmen and keepers of something very close to magic.